Good morning, everybody, or good day or good evening, wherever you are on the world. Welcome to our presentation about component-based development. We are going to present you some information about how you can do component-based development and how you can control complexity in an ever-growing application. So especially for big applications, it's very useful to build it up in components, and we're going to tell you why and give you some stakes to where you can build the application component based on how you can do that. We are going to we're going to tell you about component-based development, how to manage complexity. The different aspects of component-based development, how to split your app into components, which is also, of course, very important, and how to migrate from a big application that's not component-based to an application that is component-based. First off, a little bit about ourselves. My name is Caspár from Tergouw. I'm joined here by my colleague, Leon van Ginneken.
Hello, everybody.
He's over here. We both are software developers currently working at Alliander, and Alliander is a network operator in the Netherlands. Press the next slide.
Yeah.
It is one of the biggest network operators.
Excuse me, guys, just one interruption. Could you please take control over the slides in the presenter view? Then you can change the slides for the audience as well.
I thought we already did it.
Okay, we should have the control now.
Perfect.
Like I said, we are working for a customer named Alliander. Leon is an intern, I'm an external guy. We are working on the Monteurs app, that's what it's called in Dutch. But the English translation is basically the supporting service technicians. So people that are working on the cables, on the electrician cables, electric cables, and the gas is also supported by Alliander. And those mechanics are working with the Monteurs app to basically support them in everything that they have to do. Some smaller project characteristics. We are having over 500 users. They are working night and day on the grid, of course. Those users need to have support from the application 24/7, and the application has to run 24/7 as well. Currently, we got around 10 team members. We got 8 developers. So that's quite a big project to work on, and we have been working on it for over 3 years now. You can imagine that if you work that long with that many people on an application, then it starts to grow and it starts to grow, and you have to do something with that. Our tech stack, it is an Android-based application, or based on UI5, but it's a Cordova application, so a hybrid. There's some Java in it, so using plugins, and there's of course UI5 part. We are having a backend on Cloud Foundry. It's on the subcloud platform, and that backend is built using Node.js, of course. So that's the background of the project that we are working on. And I would like to give the word to Leon, which is going to tell you about how to build an application component-based. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Caspar. Let's go to the content, what we're here about. So we were doing this, creating this application for a couple of years, and what happened is we decided, from higher up, it was decided that the team, we were one team first, it should be split into 2. So, for me, that was a trigger to think about modularization, because how can you work with 2 teams on one app? How do you do that? How does it not become a total spaghetti, right? I mean, I think a lot of developers have that experience with code. It's just at some point not maintainable anymore. So you start looking around for ideas. Because in UI5 it's not that common. I mean, you have the Fiori Launchpad, of course, which is basically a component-based application because you have all these small tiles, which are all small apps. But it's not that common in freestyle applications. So you look around, and at some point I came across an idea, actually a quite old talk, like 10 years old, from Nicholas Sakas, which, if you don't know him, he's like a JavaScript guru. He wrote this really thick book about JavaScript development, which is really great source. And he gave a talk about how you can modularize your application really well. And we took those ideas and put them to work in UI5. And actually, the idea is not, of course, not that new. It's also now called micro front ends, for example. So you can also read a lot about that online. But you know, we just took the concepts and took our own take on it inside UI5. So why? But okay, I hope we came across like why would you want to do it? Well, you can see here some advantages. You can run them separately. Maybe you know that if you have a part in your application that's like 10 clicks away, every time you develop it, you need to test it by going 10 steps and then viewing that separate part. How easy is it if you can just start that one part and with some mock data and just test that part? If you develop that specific part as a separate component, you can test it really easily. So it makes development time less. Of course, there's also the reuse aspect. Can you take a part of your application, which is maybe useful for other teams, and can you just pick it up and move it in another team and put it there? That's often quite hard because it's integrated with the rest of the application. So maybe if you can agree on a common standard for making a component, you can make it easier to reuse a part. Like I said, can you work together with a large team? If you work together with a large team, you could maybe say, hey, those parts of the application, those components, they're yours, and these are like ours. And maybe there's a shared part, and you do that part together. So these are kind of the advantages. And of course, I think there are many developers who know this. If you're a bit experienced, you know this. But it's there are many ways to do it. You can, of course, you can put stuff in like folders and do it like that. But we found that it's perhaps useful if you standardize in a common agreement. And we took the UI component, which is really common in UI5 to have. I mean, every app today is a UI component basically. And if you take that and standardize on that, you can perhaps make that reusability and modularization possible. Maybe some examples from our application. We have, for example, you can think of like a big wizard that is like a separate part. So in our app we have like if you have a work order, some work, you can, for example, take photos. You have a report that you need to send when you dig in the ground, and you have some sketching that you can make. All these things can be, for example, separate components. So I hope did I forget anything in this slide?
Maybe.
Oh yeah, sorry. We also want to tell you, maybe by now you think, hey, where's the code? We're really sorry, there's no code today. We really just want to bring over the concepts and make you think in components and think, how could I do this in my app? And maybe later on, we can share some examples, but really decided to just keep it to the concept. So I hope you're not disappointed with that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we want to take a bit of a tour on the various parts of the architecture. So once again, this was really taken from that guru, Nicholas Sakas, and like ordered to what we thought it was useful in UI5. So first, a component. What is a component? A component, it covers a well-defined part of the application. It can be run by itself, already told you that. And what's a really important aspect is that it doesn't know anything about the other components. So the component is like unaware of its surroundings, right? It also has limited dependencies. You see in this picture what its dependencies are. There's just a set of like core modules, and that's like all it knows about the world. That's a theory, but in UI5 it's perhaps useful if you have, of course, all the UI controls that UI5 has that you can use, and perhaps you can decide there are some global libraries. Like for example, we use Moment.js for time and date manipulation. And we use Mobix State Tree. We actually gave a talk about it last year for reactive state management. So that's something where we say, okay, that's a global library, that's okay to use. But for all other things, you have to go through, go to the core modules. So that's basically some rules for what a component is. And once again, so a component is nothing more than a UI component, what you're already used to. So what we do, for example, is we have a folder in our project which says components, and then you have all the components in a separate folder in that folder. So you just get a list of all the components you have when you open this folder. Okay, let's go to the next part of the architecture. Yeah, that's the core modules. So that already, as I already said, the components, they know not that much about the world, but they do have some core modules that they can reach. So anything that your components in your app need, there is a core module for that. So they deliver functions, and they have also abstraction on external APIs. What are abstractions? Well, for example, we use OData, but we have mainly our own custom REST endpoints that we made. And we made, in our front end, we made a decoupling with the backend by creating a module, which is our backend API module. And if you look at it from a component point of view, when, for example, you want some data, you want some work orders, then you require this module, this backend API module, and you can. It has an API like backend API dot get work orders. So you don't need to specify the exact URL inside the components. You use the core module and what is available inside that core module to get whatever you want. What is the advantage of this? The advantage of abstracting is that you can also really easily mock data if you want. I can take a component. So I already said the component should be able to run by itself. So I run it by itself. And then I mock this backend API module. And I just say where you normally go to the backend and get your orders. Now you just return this mock data. So then it's just like plug and play. I have this mock data inserted. So if you use this pattern, you really get a lot of advantages from it. Another advantage is when your backend API changes. For example, you go to you decide to rewrite your whole API, and it's totally different. But you can just change this core module abstraction, and all your components, they will still work fine because all they need was this core module with a specific API. So that's maybe a whole other topic, but it's really useful if you follow this pattern as well. So now we have had the UI components and the core modules. Some examples, maybe. Yeah, so I already said the backend API. We also have logging. It's really useful to have centralized a logging module, because what we do is we want to know what is going on in the field. It's really hard to, I mean, the field technicians, they can be anywhere and they're often in the rain above a ditch. So it's really useful if they report problems that we can look at the logging, especially the error logging that they provided. So by using this centralized logging core module, it sends batch-wise all those log lines to the backend. So once again, something that's useful to have centralized. And we have a centralized event bus. That's actually, almost forgot it, that's also really important. If you remember maybe the talk from yesterday from Oliver Pancake, he also talked about, it is kind of related. It was this idea of mixing Angular with UI5. And how can you talk between those two applications? Well, he also came up with, well, the idea of using events. And that's actually the same principle is what we're using. So components can like talk to each other through events. And that's called loosely coupling. The advantage is that it never really breaks. The worst thing that can happen is that an event doesn't get triggered. Okay, so then nothing happened. But if you change your code somewhere and you have a hard dependency, like you really look from one UI component inside another component, then something can break and you get the weirdest stuff in production. But now there's just events. So it's really clear what a component needs. And well, like I said, the worst thing that can happen is that maybe nothing happens. Well, that's less than, of course, than if something breaks. So let's get to the next part of the architecture. So maybe you're asking like, okay, if you all have all these components, they can run by itself. But what does a user see? Well, of course, this is for development. It's really useful to start a component by itself, but the user, of course, wants the whole rich picture. It wants to see everything. So there's, of course, a standard starting point for the user, and we call this a shell component. And it's basically the only function that it has is placing the components on the screen. So, well, Caspár will show later some examples, like from Facebook. You have all these parts in your UI, and they can all be seen as components. And the shell component would then just place those components in the screen. And that's basically it. It should not contain more logic than that, basically, because then you would always need the shell component to run another component. So for that, we have another part of the architecture. We have the app loader. And the app loader principle is that's like a starting engine. You know, if you still own a petrol-based car, then you have a separate electro motor which starts your engine. So it's like that. So you always have this bootstrap logic that actually you always need to run. Any component you run, it needs startup logic. You can place that in like a separate module, which we call an app loader. And for example, for us, you can think about, well, actually, we have to start our backend connection because it is session-based. So it's really complex. You have this in-app browser that you need to start and a SAML flow you need to follow. So we have all this logic that is basically hidden in the app loader. There's just the app loader is responsible for starting this connection, and then it's good to go, and then you can run your component. And you can also think of a splash screen, for example. You can have it there. Anything that's logic that you actually always need before you can start your application. Let's see. I think it's back to you, right?
Yep.
All right. Caspár will take it further and talk about the advantages and some of the examples.
That's right. So thank you very much, Leon, for the detailed explanation on components and different parts of component-based development. I'm going to give you a short recap on what he said, some main advantages. So let's start by testing. So first off, the testing part is, of course, very important. You can also see in different presentations on this UI5Con, testing keeps on getting bigger and bigger and more important, because more applications are being built, and we want to have some assurance that everything is okay if we go to production with applications. So we see a continuing evolution in the testing, and component-based applications are very good to test, or very easy to test, I should say, because like Leon mentioned, there's a complete separation of your component. You can completely isolate it, run the application, and do your testing on that application. So you do not have any dependencies for everything surrounding the application. You can purely test the application itself. So that's a very handy thing to have. You can of course do your end-to-end testing using UI Verify or OPA5, or you got some different frameworks for that. And the core modules, that's also of course very important, can be unit tested separately. So those modules, they are not a component. They are kind of outside of the components, and you can test those really easily, just by unit testing. So you can make sure that everything should work, and that you should be good to go for a production run. Then some other stuff, that's collaboration with others. Like I said, we had a reasonably big team, 8 developers on UI5, on the same UI5 application. That's quite a number, I think, in general. And of course, it's important if you keep on growing in developer numbers, that there is some separation possible of work, and also separation of concern. So we are able in our team to say that, for example, 2 developers are going to work on this component and 2 developers are going to work on another component, and they will not be able, or should not be able, to break the application when they are coming together, those components, because you can isolatedly test it, build it, run it. You can do everything on your component to make it work, and there should be only just loosely coupled lines between those components. So you can make sure that you can isolate the working on that component. That's really handy. And of course, also the splitting of the responsibility. That's kind of like I said, 2 developers can work on one component and 2 on the other. It's really clear, I think. Also, of course, the reusability. That's also a part of the components. I'm going to show you some examples in just a second, and you can reuse some components that you built in different applications. So it's also possible, if you have a load of components, that you can make an application of those components and take several different components and put them into several applications, so you can reuse them. It's also quite handy. Going to show you some examples. First off, let me first start with the migration, migrating to components. How can you make sure that you do the right thing there? You should, I would say, or we would say, that you look at your application, you look at the overview of your application, and you try to define several parts of the application that can be isolated. In the example that is shown on the slide, for example, the product catalog is a completely a thing that you can completely isolate very well. So you can reuse that product catalog, and every logic that's in there, you can completely reuse it in other applications as well. And that's a really important and good thing. But there are also, of course, some other components that you can define. You can see it on the screen, the purchased items. The header can be a component, but also let's see, the card, for example. The card is just on this screen, it's just a button, but that button can trigger a navigation to another component. So that's almost like you're loading into another application, or just another component in this case, but it's completely separated and not woven into the application that you are building. It's just a separate thing. And like I said, you can have some developers that are working on that card component, and they should be able to completely do that on their own. So this was an example, based on a UI5 example by SAP. But you can take this idea, of course, and use it basically on every website, and especially bigger websites. So, for example, in this case, a Facebook screenshot. It's my Facebook. I try to blur out the name. So, you got several different components, of course, in a Facebook application. You can isolate the chat, for example. That's I think it's a perfectly just a component in Facebook, completely isolated. You got the marketplace. That's also a good example of a component. And in the Facebook example, it's easy to separate those components. You can easily spot them. And I don't know how Facebook is made up, but I would assume that they, of course, work separately on the messenger part, and separately on the overview part, and separately on the marketplace. That should be different teams, most likely, that are developing on it. So there you see the isolation in components as well, and also the power of it. That's the Facebook example. And I got one last example. That's the Amazon example. Here I try to highlight some different components as well. You can, for example, see that the search bar is also something that can be isolated. Components do not have to be necessarily very big, or it should not necessarily be a complete application, but it can also be just some smaller parts of the application, as long as you can completely isolate them and they are big enough to put them in components. You also got, of course, some you can also choose to make a fragment of something, and that's also reusable. And there are several different things you can do as a developer. But when something is big enough, like I said, for a card or a chat function, or that it feels almost like a different application, then it's perfect to make a component of. And like Leon mentioned already, for us, it's the digging in the ground. The mechanic goes from his overview into a separate component that's completely isolated in our application. It's built in the application, of course, but the thing itself can also be run separately and tested separately, etc. Let's see. I think I have said everything that I wanted to say, I guess. Do you have any extra mentions, maybe?
No, maybe, the term component is a bit overloaded, perhaps. You can use modules and whatever. We chose the term component because it's used in UI5. It's a UI component. And maybe what might be confusing is also like, there's also this concept of a reuse component. So you can, of course, also use a component to have like a widget that you use in many places. But what we're really talking about is a separate part of your application. So in principle, it should only be used once. That is the component we're talking about. You can use, of course, the same principle to make reusable components. So that makes it a bit difficult sometimes, a discussion that you have with people, but really talking about splitting your application like separate applications. So maybe a better term would be like a sub-application or something as well. Yeah. But, in IT, it's hard sometimes to name things. Let's stick with the term component for now.
Yeah. And also one last thing from my side is that, of course, it's not necessarily science or anything. It's what I mean by that is that we are trying to give you some hands-on on how to do it and how you can split your application into different parts and different components. But we are also still figuring out on how to build everything and how to do it all. So it's not, it's not, how do you say it?
The cool thing is that you can if you start doing this, you can already get advantages from it from the beginning. So we had this big monolith, and we started splitting certain really obvious parts. We started splitting it off, and it already became easier to maintain the app, because the big monolith we had, it was really clear that okay, this CSS perhaps, and this file and this module that we made, that is actually a part of this separate part of the application. So we can move all that code in a separate folder. And actually that component was already done. It was running in production for half a year. So it's done. It's just in a separate folder, and you never need to touch it again if you do it right. And so you are really splitting off stuff from the monolith one step at a time, and it just makes your code more maintainable. So we actually say, like, it's a journey that you take with your team, and you really have to talk a lot about it. There's not like one lead architect that says, okay, we should do it like this. You talk about it also with your product owner. What are the components that you have? So everyone in your team, including the product owner and the non-programmers, they can talk about the same stuff. It's this is a component, that is a component. So you really you start talking the same language, which is, I think, also an advantage. So
yeah, definitely.
So you can start with it, you can try it out, and it's not a loss. So that's what we really wanted to pitch.
Yep. Then we can go to the last slide.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Actually, we wrote a blog about it, so you can, if it was a bit vague, or if we didn't say things correctly, perhaps you can look at the blog, and you can easily read about it. Of course, you can ask questions there as well. We're planning on releasing an example, but we really want to bring across the ideas, and we hope that others will build further on it, and we will post an example, but it's just one way of doing it. As we said, we're also experimenting with it. With that.
Yeah, I got one final last mention, and that's if you want to know something more about the code aspect of it all. Like Leon said, we are working on an example application, but also yesterday there was a talk from Oliver Benke. I hope I pronounced the name right. And he told us about the opposites attract UI5 components in Angular. There are some code examples, of course, that you can use, like the event bus, and how to build components in UI5. So you can use some ideas from that. And also next up, I, of course, don't know yet what they are going to present, but Ginneken, I hope I pronounced that right as well, and Florian Vocht are going to tell you something about UI5 routing with reusable components. So I assume that there will be some interesting takeaways from there as well. And that was my final say. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks. I think back to you, Oliver.
Yes, thanks very much, guys. And you're actually ahead of time. But thankfully, we have a lot of questions for you. If you don't mind, I will just read them out in the order of the votes.
All right.
First one, how did you set up your project? Monorepo, did you use multiple repositories?
Yeah, shall I?
Yeah, it's good.
It's a monorepo. So it is just one UI5 project. So we just use folders to separate those components. Like I said, it's like we have this web app folder in the root, which is quite standard, and we have a component folder, and inside the component folder there are subfolders which you would recognize as normal UI5 application. So there inside those subfolders, there's a component.js, there are views, controllers, etc. Yeah, so that's how you could do it. We also have a folder which is called core. So it's web app/core. We put all the core modules in there. And what we actually did is we created namespaces for all the components, because I think that's quite useful to detect whether you're really only using your own stuff inside a component and the core modules, because then you can just Control F find if whether only those the namespaces that you can use are used. But it's just you can recognize as a normal UI5 application.
Yeah. And small addition is that it is possible, I would say, to have some sub-kits, as I would call them. So we thought about that, but we thought it was not necessarily a thing for our project. But it is possible, I would say. And yeah, so you can isolate your components extra in that way as well. Of course, we do have something called Git flow. So we do have a develop branch and a master branch. So yeah, and we work on separate branches ourselves. So it is a little bit easier to merge things. But yeah, I think everyone or most of us know Git flow. And if not, you can look it up, of course. But it makes things easier as well. But we do have one repository. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next question, do you have a router in every nested component, or is only the main component initializing a router and then passing the parameters to nested components using the event bus?
That's a good question. Routing is a thing, but we put a lot of time in it. But actually, in the latest version of UI5, in the latest long time supported version, I think also as well, routing with components is improved a lot, and I think the next talk is about it. What we found is that actually you can there is still we still use this root component. We are still in the migration progress, so there is still like this component in the basic the base, like a base component which has a router. But what we found is that I personally think it's a good convention to have the routing, that the first part of the route is always the component name. So it's identical to the subfolder that you use. And then you can you can have both a routing instance inside your component and inside like the shell component. It just listens to, you can just program it that it only listens to routes that are useful to that specific component. So in the end, it was actually easy to do it. But I think the next talk is about that. It's not that hard anymore. I think you used to have indeed like this workaround for it. There are some blog posts about it as well. But I think now it's a lot easier. And actually, we didn't. That's the way we do it now. Like I said. I hope that's clear.
Okay, thanks. There was another one about routing, but I think you answered that just now. So next question, how do you deploy all components? Will you build and deploy everything if any one component is updated?
Yes. Yeah. So it's just a mono.
Sure answer.
It's a monorepo. Actually, that's a whole different subject, but we have a continuous delivery pipeline set up. When you merge your code to the develop branch, you wait 15 minutes and you get 6 Android apps for 4 environments, develop, test, acceptance, production, and 2 extra release versions. Those were debug versions and release versions for acceptance and production. So it's always triggered. So if you merge, it just makes a build. So the advantage is it's quite rough, but it's also easy to think about. It's just always a new build. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That is impressive. Next question, do you solve the problem of loading different versions of the same component in the on-premise Launchpad?
I don't necessarily understand.
I don't think that's applicable for us. No, we don't. This is not related to the Fiori Launchpad.
Yeah, it might have been for your
previous
one. Yeah, sorry about that. Then, yeah, we have two more. Having one central module for backend communication implies that you do not use bindings. Is this correct?
We do use bindings, but in a different way than the OData model does. It's an interesting question because our last UF5Con, we did a talk about Mopix and Mopix State Tree. And that's what we are using. So we use the API module to get the data for us, and then we load it into a Mopix model. We are able to manipulate the data, so it's one-way binding. And we use the Mopix model to do everything in our application. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, we don't use an OData model. It's quite a different paradigm. I know that you have this, you have like these two ways of looking at it. This is really freestyle app, so it's all custom. There's of course this morning we had some talks about like the Fiori style of development where it's all like made possible by OData annotations and stuff. But this is a really complete and different paradigm. I would recommend, of course, looking up our talk from last year, then you can learn more about how we do that under the hood.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Yeah, these sessions, the recordings from last year are available in our Open UI5 YouTube channel, as will the sessions for this year's UI5Con, obviously, as well. I think we have time for one more question. How do you start a single component? Do you have a node_modules and a package.json and a UI5.yaml for every component?
One answer?
We do not have a YAML for every component, but we do have a component.js for every component. So yeah, it's kind of the same, I would say, not entirely, but it's kind of like the Fiori Launchpad does it. It starts your application from your component. So right now we have, like Leon said, we do have some, the shell component, and we are able to define which component is being loaded in that shell. So we can say we want to load the Monteurs app, so the complete application, and that application loads other components again. That's a possibility, but we are also able to say to the root or the shell component that we just want to load one component, and that component is being loaded. So it's all based on your manifest and on your component.js.
Yeah, I think I heard the term node modules. This is also, of course, you could use the node module system to get the modules, the components inside your code base, but we don't use that. So it doesn't have anything to do with the node module system.